With the premiere of Ahsoka, it seems like as good an opportunity as ever to ask a fundamental question. What is Star Wars? The answer probably seems very obvious. Star Wars is Star Wars. It's Luke and Leia, Han and Chewie. It's X-Wings and lightsabers, Sith and Jedi and the Force. I
got a bad feeling about this.
And
that's no moon.
Star Wars has been around for so long at this point that it's self-defining. It is what it is and what it has been. And there's a creeping fear that this is all that it might ever be, even as Disney plans to exploit the intellectual property indefinitely. Still, Star Wars wasn't always Star Wars. Before it became a piece of pop culture defining intellectual property, it was something else entirely. Before it set its own rigid borders, it was curious about the world outside of itself. George Lucas emerged as part of the New Hollywood movement in the 1970s, a group known as the Movie Brats that included contemporaries like Martin Scorsese or Steven Spielberg. This was perhaps the first generation that had been raised on movies as an art form. They'd absorbed all sorts of cinema through their childhood, developing an appetite and enthusiasm for the medium and its history. Images and ideas imprinted on them, and when they got the opportunity to make their own films, those films were indebted to the movies that they loved as children. These were rarely straight-up remakes that recycled established brands, characters, or plots. Instead, they were mashups and hybrids, combining these influences to make something new. Taxi Driver derived from Martin Scorsese's love of The Searchers. Brian De Palma was obsessed with the work of Alfred Hitchcock. Francis Ford Coppola channeled his love of the Roaring Twenties and Little Caesar into The Godfather. These new movies were indebted to what came before, but they fashioned those influences into something new and exciting. Lucas did something similar with Star Wars. He had famously wanted to adapt Flash Gordon but couldn't secure the rights, so he crafted a new film, drawing from the things that he loved as a child. Star Wars was something new and exciting, but it was also the product of Lucas' interests. Old adventure serials, Dam Busters, Akira Kurosawa, and more. There was an inherent curiosity to all this, the belief that if there was nothing new under the sun, there was at least a new combination of existing ideas that could be assembled. After all, that was one of the central driving narrative forces of the original Star Wars, Luke's desire to leave behind his familiar mundane reality and explore a vast universe of infinite possibilities. The best Star Wars remains true to this curious spirit. Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi shares Lucas's love of outside influences, referencing everything from Hidden Fortress to Rashomon to Wings, the first film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. The animated shows, which retained some involvement from Lucas, could quote directly from classic movies like Akira Kurosawa's Stray Dog, Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious, or Coppola's Apocalypse Now. More than that, they could indulge in delightfully weird nonsense that deviated from the established canon, and do whatever this is.
Life is a void. We search and search for answers, but there are none. Hope is just an illusion, Whack. Death is the only certainty.
Still, as Star Wars became increasingly monolithic, its curiosity shrank. It stopped looking outwards and instead turned inwards. This is most obvious with the two J.J. Abrams movies. Whereas the original Star Wars was a film influenced by Dam Busters, The Hidden Fortress, and Flash Gordon, The Force Awakens was a film influenced only by the original Star Wars.
That's not how the Force works.
The Rise of Skywalker was a collection of familiar Star Wars iconography jumbled together with no artistry.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
The same applies to most of the live-action streaming shows, with the notable exception of Andor, which feels heavily indebted to the political thrillers of Alan J. Pakula. Sure, The Mandalorian is a show about two original characters, but those characters are designed to remind viewers of existing Star Wars characters, Boba Fett and Yoda. Creator Jon Favreau might have thrown in references to other classics of the era, like Jaws, Aliens, and Sorcerer, but The Mandalorian was another show where the biggest influence was Star Wars itself. You can even see that in the choice of planets in the early episodes, evoking deserts, ice worlds, and forest moons of the original trilogy. Shows like The Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi dropped even the pretense of using original characters that happened to look like existing characters, and instead just used existing characters in largely familiar locations. And again, for a franchise where the first movie is literally about how the protagonist can't wait to get off Tatooine, this franchise sure likes spending a lot of time on Tatooine.
Found anything yet? We ain't found shit.
Remember the cantina scene in the original Star Wars? When there was this room populated by a variety of exotic aliens, and it felt like each one could have been the star of their own movie that the audience might never see. That is one of the most iconic scenes in the franchise, and it seems impossible today. Star Wars is now mostly just things you've already seen Star Wars do. This carries over to Ahsoka. Even beyond the opening scroll, the show's big opening set pieces are revealing. In the opening action beat of the first episode, Sith Lord Balin's skull tears through a New Republic ship. There's a level of abstraction here, Star Wars nostalgia reflected back on itself. This is obviously evocative of the big Vader set piece from the end of Rogue One, which was itself an update on Vader's introduction in the opening scenes of the original Star Wars. Then the series introduces its title character. The sequence isn't technically a Star Wars reference, but it's an overt homage to another piece of Lucasfilm intellectual property, as Ahsoka does her best Indiana Jones impression. Like Star Wars, Indiana Jones was another example of Lucas and his friend Spielberg combining influences from their childhood to make something new and exciting. Now, in Dial of Destiny, the Indiana Jones franchise is mostly just allusions to itself. That said, Ahsoka reflects the shifting gaze of the nostalgia guiding modern Star Wars. Abrams and Favreau's Star Wars tended to draw most overtly from the original trilogy. In contrast, Ahsoka is more nostalgic for a more recent period, the early days of Disney's ownership of the brand. Ahsoka is a continuation of Rebels, one of the first projects after Disney bought Star Wars. The opening scene is a riff on a fan-favorite beat from Rogue One. Even the structure of the show seems designed to recall the early days of The Mandalorian. Given the challenges currently facing the brand, why wouldn't they want to evoke something that launched as the most in-demand show in the world? Gone is the complex, interlocking continuity of the later seasons, along with plots about politics and scheming among former Imperial officers. In favor of a simple story about a wandering hero, a strong but silent type with repressed paternal instincts, navigating a series of relatively self-contained adventures that build to a larger arc about the threat posed by Imperial remnants, in the gap between the original and sequel trilogies. Nostalgia becomes reflexive. Ahsoka is nostalgic for an era defined by its own nostalgia for an earlier era. The snake eats its own tail. This is not a criticism of Ahsoka, which is a solid and sturdy piece of Star Wars. It certainly holds together better than recent efforts like The Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi, let alone The Rise of Skywalker. However, it is a reminder of how insular and incurious the Star Wars franchise has become, more reluctant to look outside itself for inspiration. That galaxy far, far away seems a lot smaller than it once did. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.